The bag was lighter than a life should be, and that was how Hannah Mercer knew they had not only sent her away, they had tried to decide how much of her was allowed to leave. It hung from her right hand by a fraying canvas strap, bumping softly against her knee as she stood outside the iron gates of Silverpine Pack and listened to the lock settle behind her. The sound was small, almost polite, which made it worse. A life did not end with thunder. It ended with a click, a breath of winter air, and the sight of every familiar window turning gold behind you while you stood on the wrong side of the wall. Hannah told herself the trembling in her fingers was from the cold. It was not. The temperature had dropped below 40 degrees, and the wind moving through the pines carried the sharp smell of snow waiting somewhere north of the ridge, but she had lived in these woods since she was 6 years old. She knew cold. This was not cold. This was the body trying to understand how a place that had held your name for 23 years could let you go with one bag and no one at the gate to say goodbye. Inside the bag were 3 shirts rolled tight, 1 pair of socks, a wool sweater that had belonged to her mother, a pocket knife with a loose handle, a tin of matches she did not trust, 3 silver dollars wrapped in a handkerchief, and a folded map so old the creases had gone soft as cloth. At the very bottom, tucked into the lining where no one had thought to look, was a brass key on a thin chain, darkened with age, its bow shaped like a crescent moon caught inside a ring of thorns. Hannah had found it 2 nights ago inside the hem of her mother's sweater, sewn there with careful gray thread, hidden so well it felt less like an object and more like a message that had waited years to be discovered. She had not known what it opened. She still did not know. But when Mason Vale had stood in the great hall that morning with Brielle Hart at his side and said, "One bag, nothing more," Hannah had touched the hidden key through the sweater and understood one thing with a clarity. That frightened her. Her mother had expected this day before Hannah ever did. The road beyond Silverpine sloped down for half a mile before it disappeared into the pinewood, a pale ribbon of frozen dirt and old wool tracks. Hannah looked at it, then back at the gates. The carved wolf crest above the arch stared down at her with its stone mouth open, as if it had been caught mid-howl and silenced there forever. She waited for pain to do something dramatic. She waited for tears, for anger, for one last desperate wish that someone would open the gate and call her back. Nothing came. Only a steady, hollow quiet, and beneath it, something smaller but harder, like a seed under frozen ground. Hannah adjusted the bag in her hand, lifted her chin, and stepped onto the road. Behind her, Silverpine remained warm and bright and closed. Ahead of her, the woods waited without promise. She had 1 bag, $3, a map she could barely read, and a key to a door she had not yet found. It should have felt like the end of everything. Instead, with every step away from the gate, Hannah felt the strangest certainty growing in her chest, quiet and impossible to prove. Somewhere beyond those trees, something old still knew her name. Hours earlier, before the road, before the locked gate, before the winter air had made a stranger of her own breath, Hannah Mercer had stood in the center of Silverpine Hall with the eyes of her pack arranged around her like candles that gave no warmth. The room smelled of cedar smoke, polished floors, and the heavy breakfast the kitchen had prepared for people who still belonged there. She noticed that more than she wanted to. The ordinary things. The blue pitcher on the council table with a chip near the handle. The row of boots beneath the elder benches. The pine garland Brielle Hart had ordered hung above the hearth because she said the hall looked too plain for the Luna ceremony next month. Ordinary things had a cruelty of their own when they kept behaving as if nothing had changed. Mason Vale stood on the raised step near the council chairs, dressed in the dark coat he wore when he wanted every word to sound official. Brielle stood beside him. In winter white, one hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression shaped into something soft enough to be mistaken for mercy by anyone who did not know how carefully she practiced it. Hannah kept her hands folded in front of her dress and made herself look at Mason, not at the pack members behind him, not at the women who had shared bread with her 2 days ago and now found the floor suddenly interesting, not at old Mrs. Alder from the laundry, whose mouth trembled once before she pressed it flat. Mason had not raised his voice. That was part of what made it feel final. Loud men could be argued with. Mason spoke as if the decision had already become part of the walls. He said the pack could no longer carry unnecessary burdens through winter. He said Silverpine had entered a season of rebuilding. He said every member had to contribute in clear and measurable ways. He did not say Hannah was weak. He did not have to. The word moved through the room anyway, passed from lowered eyes to tightened mouths to Brielle's small, patient sigh. Hannah listened to him turn her life into a matter of storage and supplies, and somewhere inside her, something went very still. When he finished, Brielle stepped forward with a folded canvas bag in both hands. It was not Hannah's. It came from the supply closet near the back door, the kind used for flour sacks or old linens. Brielle held it out as if presenting a gift. "One bag," Mason said. "Nothing more." Hannah looked at the bag before she took it. The canvas was rough and smelled faintly of soap, dust, and someone else's hands. For a moment, she thought of her room at the end of the west corridor, the narrow bed, the cracked mirror, the wooden box under the floorboard where she kept her mother's letters. She thought of the quilt her mother had sewn from old dresses, the blue mug with the uneven glaze, the small stack of books she had copied recipes into because paper was cheaper than memory. "You may collect clothing for the road," Mason added, as if he were being generous. "Personal items only. No documents. No coin from pack stores. No heirlooms whose ownership cannot be verified." At that, Brielle's gaze flicked to Hannah's face so quickly most people would have missed it. Hannah did not. She understood then that this was not only exile. This was sorting. This was choosing what pieces of her were safe to let leave and what pieces had to remain behind, locked in rooms other people would search once she was gone. She accepted the bag with both hands because one hand might have shaken. The canvas collapsed between her fingers, empty and soft, waiting to be filled with the smallest version of a life. Mason watched her, perhaps expecting her to ask why, perhaps hoping she would make the kind of scene that would help everyone feel better about what they were allowing. Hannah gave him neither. She only said, in a voice so calm it sounded borrowed, "How long do I have?" Mason's jaw moved once. "Until sunset." Brielle tilted her head with gentle satisfaction, and Hannah realized the mercy had been measured carefully. Enough time to pack. Not enough time to think. Enough time to leave. Not enough time to find what they were afraid she might carry out. Hannah packed less slowly than they expected and more carefully than they deserved. That was the only rebellion available to her in the narrow room at the end of the west corridor, where the afternoon light came through the single window in a pale stripe across the floorboards. She laid the canvas bag open on her bed and chose each item as if someone were watching from inside the walls. 3 shirts because 4 would look hopeful. 1 pair of socks because winter was coming and cruelty often forgot feet. The wool sweater because it was her mother's, and because Brielle had said no heirlooms whose ownership could not be verified, which meant she had not looked closely enough at the things poor women kept. Hannah folded it with both hands, pressing her palm once over the uneven hem where she had found the hidden key. She did not take the letters from under the floorboard. That hurt more than she allowed her face to show, even alone. Instead, she slid one loose page free from the bottom of the stack, the one where her mother had drawn a small map in the corner beside a recipe for blackberry preserves. Hollow Creek was written so faintly it could have been mistaken for a stain. Hannah folded the page twice and tucked it inside the lining of the bag, behind a tier no one would bother to mend. By the time she stepped into the corridor, the house had entered that strange hour before sunset when servants moved quickly and important people believed themselves unobserved. Hannah knew those hours. She had lived most of her life inside the spaces between other people's attention. She was halfway to the back stairwell when voices came through the half-open door of the old records room. Not loud voices. That would have been kinder. These were voices lowered by confidence, the kind people used when they thought power itself could keep secrets. Brielle spoke first. She asked if Mason was certain the council would not ask for Hannah in person when the Hollow Creek file reopened. Hannah stopped so completely that even the bag against her hip went still. Mason answered that the notice had arrived too late for complications, and by the time Northridge reviewed the boundary claim, Hannah would be outside Silverpine protection and easy to describe as unstable, confused, or simply gone by choice. Brielle made a small sound, not quite a laugh. She said a girl carrying one bag could not claim land against a recognized pack. Mason replied that land was never the danger. Blood was. The words moved through Hannah without making sense at first. Blood. Hollow Creek. Council. Her mother's faded map pressed like a warm coal against the side of the bag. Mason continued, his voice flat and practical. If the Mercer line was acknowledged, the old warden rights would return with it. The safe house would not answer to Silverpine, and neither would the creek road, the north pasture, or the stone crossing. Brielle said Hannah did not even know what her mother was. Mason said ignorance was useful only while it stayed permanent. Hannah stood in the corridor with one hand on the cold wall and learned, in the space of 3 breaths, that she had not been sent away because she was nothing. She had been sent away because something belonging to her had survived everyone who tried to bury it. A floorboard creaked somewhere behind her. Hannah moved before fear could name itself. She walked down the servant stairs, through the laundry passage, and out toward the rear yard with her head lowered and her pace unchanged. No running. Running made people look. At the pump, she paused long enough to wet a cloth and wipe her hands as if she had come for ordinary reasons. Through the kitchen window, she could see Brielle's reflection passing in the hall, white dress, lifted chin, a woman already imagining a future built on locked rooms and missing papers. Hannah touched the side of the bag where the hidden map rested. Then she looked toward the tree line beyond the garden wall. Hollow Creek had been only a name that morning. Now it felt like a door. And somewhere, waiting beyond miles of pine and cold road, there was a key in her bag that Mason Vale had failed to fear because he had never believed her mother would trust Hannah with anything important. The woods did not welcome Hannah, but they did not reject her either, and after Silverpine, that felt almost like kindness. She followed the old road until the pack wall disappeared behind the black lace of pine branches, then left the wheel tracks before anyone could guess she had stayed on them too long. The map from her mother was spread against her palm, the paper softened by age and the faint oil of careful hands. It did not give directions the way modern maps did. There were no neat mile markers, no road names, no measured distance between one safe place and the next. There was only a line of ink following the creek bed, a crooked mark for the stone crossing, and 3 words written near the edge where the paper had browned with time. Keep north by water. Hannah read them twice, then folded the page and tucked it back into the hidden seam of the bag. Water meant the creek. The creek meant Hollow Creek. That was enough to keep moving. The snow had not fallen yet, but the air had the heavy silence that came before it, as if the sky were holding its breath. Pine needles softened her steps. Frozen mud cracked lightly beneath her boots. Somewhere high above, a crow called once and then thought better of it. Hannah walked for nearly 2 miles before she noticed the second set of sounds behind her. Not close. Not clumsy. A pause when she paused. A shift when she shifted. Something moving with patience. She did not look back immediately. Looking back told a follower when fear had arrived. Instead, she adjusted the bag on her shoulder and kept walking until she reached a patch of dead ferns near a fallen birch. There, she bent as if tying her boot and pressed her fingers into the dirt. The ground held more than one mark. Wolf tracks, large enough to belong to grown males, crossed the edge of the trail and vanished into the brush. Not wild wolves. Wild wolves did not care enough to follow an omega with an old bag and no food worth stealing. Hannah stood slowly, her face calm, her pulse loud in her ears. Silverpine had taught her many things it had never meant to teach. How to step on roots instead of leaves. How to move downwind when someone was trying to catch your scent. How to appear smaller without becoming less alert. She left the trail at the next bend and walked through a shallow wash where rain had carved a narrow path between stones. For a 1/4 mile, she stayed in the water, though the cold soaked through her boots and climbed her ankles like a warning. At the far bank, she took ash from the bottom of her match tin, the gray powder saved from an old stove, and rubbed it lightly over the cuffs of her coat and the soles of her boots. Her mother had once told her ash confused a careless nose. Hannah had laughed then because she had been 12 years old and still believed every lesson was only a lesson. Now she used it as if it were scripture. The sounds behind her thinned, then widened, searching. Good. She did not smile. Hope was useful only when kept quiet. By late afternoon, the land began to change. The pines grew older, farther apart, their trunks wide and dark with moss. The creek appeared beside her, narrow but quick, slipping over stones with a silver sound that made the silence feel less empty. Hannah followed it north until her legs ached and the strap of the bag had rubbed a sore line across her shoulder. Once, she stopped beneath a hemlock and ate half of a hard biscuit she had taken from the kitchen shelf while no one was looking. It tasted like flour, salt, and guilt. She ate it anyway. When she unfolded the map again, the last light was fading behind the ridge. The ink line ended at a drawing of a small square beside the creek. Not a house exactly. Not a cabin. A shape with a narrow tower and a mark beneath it like a moon trapped in thorns. Hannah looked up. Across the water, past a curtain of bare branches and winter vines, something made of stone waited in the dusk. It was low, crooked, half covered by the forest, and so still it seemed less abandoned than asleep. Hannah stood on the bank with cold water at her feet and the brass key hidden against her mother's sweater. Behind her, far off among the trees, one of her followers gave a soft, uncertain whine. In front of her, the old stone door faced the creek as if it had been watching the road for years and had finally seen who it was waiting for. Hannah crossed the creek where the stones rose just high enough above the water to pretend they were a bridge. The soles of her boots slipped twice, and the second time her hand shot out to catch a branch glazed with frost, but she did not fall. Falling felt like something the day wanted from her, and she had already given the day enough. On the far bank, the stone building seemed smaller and larger at once, small because the forest had nearly swallowed it, larger because every step toward it made the air feel more aware. It was not a cottage. Cottages were made for smoke in the chimney, bread on the table, curtains moving in summer windows. This place had been built for watching. The lower walls were thick gray stone, darkened by rain and time. A narrow square tower rose from one corner, broken near the top where ivy had twisted through the old lookout window. The roof sagged on the creek side, and winter vines covered half the doorway in ropes as thick as Hannah's wrist. Moss filled the cracks between the stones, and a rusted iron lantern hung beside the door, tilted forward as if listening. Yet there were no paw prints in the muddy strip before the threshold. Hannah noticed that before she noticed anything else. Deer tracks marked the creek bed. Rabbit prints crossed near the ferns. Her own boot marks followed her from the water. But around the door, the ground was smooth, untouched, almost clean. Behind her, across the creek, the brush shifted once. The wolves following her had reached the opposite bank, but none of them crossed. Hannah stood very still and let that fact settle inside her. They were not waiting because they had lost her. They were waiting because something in front of her mattered more than hunger, command, or curiosity. She set the canvas bag down beside her feet and pulled the vines away from the door one by one. The cold had stiffened them, but they gave under her hands with dry, reluctant snaps. Beneath them was a door made of dark wood banded with iron. It should have been ruined. Everything else was. But the wood had not softened, and the hinges did not hang loose, and the lock, though black with age, held its shape as if someone had polished it yesterday and then allowed a century to pass. Hannah reached into the bag for her mother's sweater. Her fingers found the brass key in the hidden seam, and for a moment she did not take it out. She thought of her mother's hands guiding hers over flour dough, over torn cloth, over herbs drying on the kitchen line. She thought of all the ordinary lessons that had never sounded like preparation until now. Then she drew out the key. It was warmer than it should have been. Not hot, not magical in any grand way, only warm enough to feel impossible against her cold palm. The crescent moon at the bow of it caught the last gray light. Hannah slid it into the lock. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the iron gave a low click that traveled through the door, the stone wall, and the ground beneath her boots. The building seemed to exhale. Dust stirred along the threshold though no wind touched it. Across the creek, one of the wolves backed away with a soft sound that was almost human in its uncertainty. Hannah pushed the door open. It moved heavily, but it moved, and the smell inside came out to meet her: old ash, cold stone, dried cedar, and something faintly sweet, like lavender kept between pages. The main room lay in shadow. There was a hearth built into the far wall, a table with one broken leg, shelves lined with cloudy jars, and a narrow staircase climbing into darkness. On the floor near the center of the room, half hidden beneath dust, was the same symbol from the key, a crescent moon caught in iron thorns. Hannah stepped over the threshold, and the ache in her chest changed shape. It did not disappear. It simply made room for something else. The door had opened for her. Not for Mason. Not for Brielle. Not for the wolves waiting beyond the creek. For her. The first night inside the stone house did not feel like shelter at first. It felt like being allowed into a room that had not yet decided what to do with her. Hannah closed the door with both hands and stood with her back against it while the last of the daylight thinned behind the small, dirty windows. The main room held its silence carefully. Dust lay over the table, the shelves, the hearthstone, and the old jars as if time had fallen here in soft gray layers and no one had wanted to disturb it. Her own breathing sounded too loud. The bag sat near her feet, small and tired, looking even emptier inside this place that had waded through years of weather with its secrets still locked in the walls. Hannah crossed to the hearth and knelt. The ashes inside were old, pale, and fine as powder, but beneath them she found dry kindling stacked in a narrow stone recess, wrapped in oilcloth that had not rotted. That made her pause. Someone had left it there for a night exactly like this, for hands exactly this cold, for a person who arrived with nothing but enough stubbornness to open the door. She used one match. It flared weakly, almost died, then caught the edge of the kindling with a thin orange line. The fire grew slowly, not bright enough to warm the whole room, but enough to change the shape of the shadows. Enough to make the jars on the shelves glimmer. Enough to show the carved words above the hearth, half hidden beneath soot. Hannah wiped them clean with her sleeve. Mercy is a wall when power forgets its name. She read the sentence once, then again, and something in her throat tightened so quickly she had to look away. Outside, the first sound came from across the creek. A low call, not quite a howl, not quite a warning. Another answered from the trees to the east. Hannah went still. The followers had not left. She moved to the window without stepping fully into view and saw their shapes among the pines, darker than the dusk, patient at the edge of the clearing. 3 wolves. Maybe 4. They did not come closer, but they did not go. Hannah thought of Mason in the records room, his voice saying blood was the danger. She thought of Brielle's white dress and careful Mercy. Then the brass key, still hanging from the lock inside the door, gave a faint tremor. The floor beneath Hannah's boots answered. Not loudly. Not like thunder. More like a sleeping thing remembering its own heartbeat. The crescent anthorn symbol in the center of the room began to show through the dust with a dim silver glow. Hannah stepped back, one hand pressing against the table. The light spread along hair-thin lines between the stones, traveling under the door, up the wall, around the window frame. Outside, one wolf took a step into the clearing. The light brightened. The wolf stopped as if it had reached an invisible fence. It lowered its head, confused, then backed away. No crash. No injury. No dramatic display. Just refusal. The house had said no, and the night had listened. Hannah stood in the middle of the room with the fire at her back and the old ward shining under her feet, and for the first time since morning, she let herself breathe all the way in. Her mother's voice came back to her then, not as memory exactly, but as warmth moving through a cold place. Some doors are not locked to keep people out, Hannah. Some are waiting for the right person to come home. Hannah looked at the glowing mark, at the key, at the wolves beyond the creek who suddenly seemed much farther away than they had before. She was still alone. She was still hungry. She still owned almost nothing. But the door had opened, the fire had caught, and the house had chosen its side. Morning came pale and uncertain, laying a thin silver light across the floor as if the house itself had not slept. Hannah woke beside the hearth with her mother's sweater folded under her cheek and the canvas bag tucked beneath one arm. For a moment she did not remember where she was. Then the smell of old stone, cedar smoke, and cold creek water returned, and with it everything else. Silverpine. Mason's voice. Brielle's careful smile. The wolves waiting beyond the clearing. The glowing mark beneath the dust. The fire had burned low but not out, and that felt like a decision. Hannah sat up slowly, every muscle stiff from the floor, and looked around the main room with daylight to help her see what fear had hidden the night before. The place was worse than she had hoped and better than she had feared. One window was cracked from corner to corner. The table leaned because one leg had rotted halfway through. The roof had let water in near the north wall, leaving a dark stain shaped like a handprint above the shelves. The hearth worked, but the chimney needed clearing. The back door was swollen shut. The stairs to the tower creaked under the weight of a glance. It should have discouraged her. Instead, Hannah found herself making a list. Not because she felt brave. Bravery sounded too clean for what she had. What she had was colder, smaller, and more useful. She had nowhere else to go. She started with the chimney, using a broken broom handle and a strip torn from the hem of her oldest shirt. Soot came down in soft black clouds, dusting her hair, her sleeves, the bridge of her nose. She coughed into her elbow and kept working. Then she dragged fallen branches from the edge of the woods, never crossing beyond the ring where the ward had shone the night before, and stacked them beside the hearth. She found a bucket near the back wall, dented but whole, and carried water from the creek in 4 slow trips, each one making her arms ache. By noon, she had cleared the table, repaired the broken leg with a wedge of stone, and tied the cracked window shut with wire she found in a drawer beneath the stairs. The work changed the room 1 inch at a time. Not beautifully. Not yet. But honestly. Each repair seemed to wake something. When she swept the crescent thorns. Symbol clean, the silver lines in the floor flickered once, faint as breath on glass. When she opened the stuck back door after nearly an hour of prying and patient pulling, a low warmth moved through the stones under her feet. Behind the door was a narrow pantry with empty shelves, 3 sealed jars of dried beans, a sack of salt hardened at the corners, and a wooden box carved with the Mercer name. Hannah stared at the box for several seconds before touching it. The letters were shallow, worn by age, but unmistakable. Mercer. Not Vale. Not Silverpine. Mercer. Inside were folded records wrapped in oilcloth, a small iron seal, and a ledger written in her mother's hand. Hannah knew the shape of that handwriting the way she knew the shape of her own fingers. The first page was dated 18 years ago. Hollow Creek Warden House, it began. Shelter Ledger, Winter Season. Below that were names, not landowners or council members, but people. Widows from the Eastern Road. 2 children from a burned farm. A healer turned away during fever season. 3 Omegas without pack claim. Each name had notes beside it. Warm bed. Food for 4 days. Safe passage arranged. Hannah sat on the pantry floor and read until the light shifted. Her mother had not owned a forgotten building. She had guarded a refuge. The house had never been meant to make someone powerful. It had been meant to keep power from becoming the only law in the room. Hannah pressed her palm over the Mercer name on the box, and the ward beneath the floor answered with a quiet silver pulse. This time, she did not step back. By the 3rd morning, the house no longer looked abandoned from the inside, though from the clearing it still wore its ruin like a cloak. Hannah had learned that this was useful. The roof still sagged when seen from the creek road, and the vines still covered enough stone to make the place seem forgotten, but inside, the hearth drew cleanly, the pantry shelves had been wiped down, the cracked window was sealed against the wind, and the Mercer ledger lay wrapped again in oilcloth beneath the loose pantry board where only careful hands would find it. She worked until her palms ached and her Shoulders felt heavier than the canvas bag ever had. Work kept fear from spreading. Work gave shape to the hours. Work made it harder to remember that Mason could be speaking her name in Silverpine Hall at that very moment, turning her absence into whatever story served him best. Near noon, while Hannah was scraping moss from the stones beside the back step, the birds went quiet. She had come to trust that more than any warning bell. The forest always knew before people did. She stood slowly, the dull edge of an old garden spade in one hand, and looked toward the creek crossing. 4 riders had stopped on the opposite bank. They were not Silverpine. Their horses were larger, mountain-bred, with dark tack and silver clasps that caught the winter light. The men wore charcoal cloaks fastened at the shoulder with the crest of North Ridge, a wolf beneath a crown of antlers. Hannah recognized the mark from old council notices pinned in Silverpine's entry hall. She had never seen it this close. Then the 5th rider moved forward, and even before she understood who he was, the air changed around him. Not loudly. Not with performance. It was only that everyone else seemed arranged by rank and habit, while he seemed arranged by gravity. Caleb Stone dismounted at the creek's edge. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a dark riding coat without ornament except the silver crest at his collar. His hair was brown, cut short, his face calm in the unreadable way of men who had spent years being obeyed before finishing a sentence. He looked at the house first, not at Hannah. That told her something. He saw structures before stories, defenses before rumors, weak points before explanations. His gaze moved across the tower, the old doorway, the clean threshold, the repaired window, the faint line in the clearing where the ward had shone the night before. Only then did he look at her. Hannah did not lower her eyes. She wanted to. Habit rose in her like an old command. But the Mercer name was beneath her roof now, and her mother's ledger was beneath her floor, and the house had not opened for a woman who intended to shrink at the first sign of power. One of Caleb's. Guards called across the creek and asked by whose permission she occupied a protected boundary property. Hannah wiped one dirty hand on her skirt and answered that the door had opened with her key. The guard frowned as if that were not an answer. Caleb raised one hand, and the man fell silent. Then Caleb stepped onto the first stone of the crossing. The ward woke before his boot touched the far bank. Silver light moved through the grass, not bright, not threatening, only certain. Caleb stopped. His eyes lowered to the line at his feet. For the first time, something in his expression shifted. Interest, perhaps. Or recognition. He took one more careful step. The air between him and the clearing tightened, invisible but unmistakable, and the old lantern beside the door began to tremble without wind. Hannah felt the floor of the house answer behind her, a quiet pulse through stone and soil. Caleb Stone, Alpha King of North Ridge, stood at the edge of a ruined refuge and could not enter. He did not force it. That surprised her most. He simply looked from the ward to Hannah, and when he spoke, his voice carried over the creek, low and even. This house is deciding whether I am welcome. Hannah tightened her grip on the spade, not because she meant to use it, but because holding something helped her remain herself. Maybe, she said. Or maybe it already decided what kind of man has to ask. Caleb did not cross the ward that day, and because he did not try, Hannah began to understand that power could have more than one shape. He remained on the creek side of the boundary while one of his guards unfolded a leather case and recorded the markings on the old stones. He asked questions without raising his voice. When had she arrived? How had she opened the door? Whether the house had harmed anyone. Whether Silverpine had given written notice before removing her from its protection. That last question made Hannah look up from the step where she had been standing with the spade still in her hand. Removing her from its protection sounded almost civil, almost legal, nothing like the click of the gate behind her or the empty bag Brielle had placed in her hands. Before she could answer, the forest gave its second warning of the day. Birds lifted from the pines in a dark scatter. Hooves struck the frozen road beyond the creek, too many for Caleb's patrol, too fast to be casual. Mason Vale arrived first, riding a black horse that tossed its head at the smell of the ward. Brielle followed beside him in a pale blue cloak trimmed with white fur, beautiful in the polished way of a knife kept on display. 6 Silverpine riders stopped behind them, their faces arranged into seriousness, though 2 of them would not meet Hannah's eyes. Mason looked at Caleb, then at the house, then at Hannah, and in that order she learned exactly what frightened him most. Not that she was alive. Not that she had found shelter. That someone higher than him had found her standing in front of it. Alpha King Stone, Mason said, his tone smooth enough to slide over ice. We were not informed Northridge had taken interest in a minor internal matter. Caleb's expression did not change. A boundary ward old enough to refuse royal passage is not minor. The words settled over the clearing with quiet weight. Brielle's smile tightened. She looked at Hannah as if they were still in Silverpine Hall and Hannah was still expected to become smaller under her gaze. This girl is confused, Brielle said gently. She was dismissed for instability and theft of pack property. We came to retrieve what she carried away before she embarrasses herself further. Hannah felt the old instinct rise, the urge to defend, explain, make herself understood quickly before someone decided understanding was inconvenient. Then the house pulsed once beneath her feet. Not loudly. Just enough. She set the spade down. From inside the doorway, she picked up the canvas bag and carried it to the threshold where everyone could see it. It looked smaller in daylight, worn and plain, the sort of bag no one powerful ever imagined could matter. Hannah opened it without hurry. First came the sweater. Then the folded map. Then the brass key with the crescent caught in thorns. Mason's face changed before he could stop it. Caleb saw. So did Brielle, whose hand closed around the reins until the leather creaked. Hannah unfolded the map and held it up, the old ink trembling slightly in the wind. My mother left this hidden in her own clothing, she said. Not in your records room. Not in your storehouse. Not in anything Silverpine owned. Mason gave a short laugh with no warmth in it. A child's drawing proves nothing. No, Caleb said, looking at the mark on the key. But a warden's seal might. Hannah reached into the bag one last time and drew out the small iron seal from the pantry box. She had wrapped it in a strip of cloth, and when she uncovered it, the same symbol faced the clearing. Crescent moon. Iron thorns. Mercer name cut below. The ward brightened along the grass as if it had heard itself spoken in metal. Mason dismounted then, too quickly for calm, and stepped toward the crossing. The silver line rose before him. He stopped with one boot on the first stone, his face flushed with anger he could not afford to show. Brielle moved beside him, her voice sharper now. That property reverted to Silverpine decades ago. Caleb turned to her. Then you will have the deed. For the first time since Hannah had known her, Brielle had no immediate answer. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every locked drawer, every missing letter, every careful lie that had depended on Hannah never finding a door that opened for her. Caleb did not ask Mason for the deed a second time. He only turned to the guard with the leather case and said, "Record the absence of proof." The guard wrote it down in a neat hand while the whole clearing seemed to hold its breath. Mason stared at the page as if ink itself had betrayed him. Brielle's face had gone pale beneath the careful color on her cheeks, but she still tried to smile, still tried to make the moment smaller than it was. There must have been an administrative error, she said. Old boundary records are notoriously difficult. Caleb looked at the iron seal in Hannah's hand. Some records are difficult because time damages them, he said. Others are difficult because people do. No one answered. The creek moved softly over the stones, indifferent and honest. Hannah stood in the doorway with the canvas bag at her feet, and for the first time since Silverpine Hall, she felt the shape of the room around her even though she was outside. The house was behind her. The ward was beneath her. Her mother's name was in her hand. Mason could speak, accuse, deny, and rearrange his face into whatever authority he wanted, but he could not step past the line in the grass. That mattered more than any argument. Caleb ordered the boundary placed under North Ridge review until the council could examine the Mercer ledger, the map, and the warden's seal. He did not say Hannah was helpless. He did not say he would take charge of the house for her own good. He asked whether she would permit one clerk to copy the records inside while remaining under her supervision. The words were so unexpected that Hannah almost missed their weight. Permit. Under her supervision. She looked at the old doorway, the soot-dark hearth, the repaired window, the pantry where the ledger waited beneath the floorboard. Then she looked back at Mason and Brielle, who had once decided a single bag was all of her life that needed to leave. Yes, she said. One clerk. No Silverpine. The ward glowed once, soft and silver, as if approving the terms. Mason's horse stepped backward before Mason touched the reins. By sunset, Silverpine's riders were gone, their hoofprints stopping at the creek as proof of how far they had been allowed to come. Caleb remained only long enough to leave 2 sealed notices on the outer stone, one declaring Hollow Creek under legal protection until the review was complete, the other recognizing Hannah Mercer as acting warden of the house by blood claim and active key. The word acting made one corner of his mouth shift, almost a smile, as if he knew the house had made its own decision before any council could catch up. Winter came 3 days later. Snow covered the road, the creek stones, the old tracks at the boundary, and the place where Mason had stood unable to enter. Hannah kept the fire alive. She repaired the second window. She cleaned the tower stairs. She hung her mother's sweater on a peg near the hearth, not hidden now, not folded away like evidence. The canvas bag she left by the door, empty except for the brass key, because some objects needed to be remembered for what they had carried. Within 2 weeks, the first woman arrived at dusk with a child asleep against her shoulder and fear held carefully behind her eyes. Hannah opened the door before the woman knocked. A week after that came an old healer with frost on his sleeves, then a boy from the eastern road, then 2 sisters who had walked 9 miles through snow because someone in a market town had whispered that Hollow Creek had woken again. Each time, the ward brightened. Each time, the house seemed less like a ruin and more like a promise learning how to stand upright. Caleb returned at the end of the month with the final council mark, but he stopped at the boundary and waited until Hannah nodded him through. This time, the ward allowed him to cross. He did not look triumphant. He looked humbled, which suited the doorway better. The new deed bore her name in dark ink, Hannah Mercer, warden of Hollow Creek. She held it without trembling. Outside, the repaired lantern swung gently in the wind. Inside, the hearth was warm, the pantry was full, and voices moved through the rooms with the cautious relief of people discovering they could rest. Hannah placed the deed inside the Mercer box and closed the lid. She had left Silverpine with almost nothing, but nothing had not been empty after all. It had held a key, a name, a map, and enough quiet strength to build a door the right people could enter and the wrong ones would never break.